There are stories that time tries to bury beneath layers of silence, beneath the weight of ideologies that prefer oblivion to truth. There are men whose very existence represents a challenge to everything we think we know about the limits of human courage. There are names that were erased from books, torn from collective memories, condemned to disappear as if they had never existed. This is the story of one of those men. A man who voluntarily walked into hell, not because he failed to understand what awaited him, but precisely because he understood it better than anyone. A man who chose the most extreme suffering humanity has ever conceived, not out of madness or fanaticism, but out of a sense of duty so deep, so unbreakable, that it defies all conventional logic. His name was Witold Pilecki, and in what he did within the walls of the Auschwitz concentration camp remains, to this day, one of the most extraordinary, most harrowing, and most tragically overlooked acts of heroism of the entire Second World War. Before we delve into this story, I want to ask you something very simple. If this kind of historical documentary grips you, if you believe these stories deserve to be told and remembered, subscribe to the channel. It is completely free and helps us enormously to continue producing content of this quality. Immersive documentaries that rescue from oblivion the stories the world needs to hear. A simple click on the subscribe button makes a real difference. Now, let us return to our story. To understand what Witold Pilecki did, and above all, why he did it, we need to go back in time. We need to return to a Europe that was falling apart, to a continent sleepwalking toward the darkest abyss in its history. We need to understand first what Poland was before everything collapsed, what it meant to be Polish in those years, and what kind of man Pilecki was before he became legend. Witold Pilecki was born on the 13th of May, 1901, in Olonets, a small city in Russian Karelia, territory of the vast Russian Empire. His family belonged to the minor Polish nobility, a lineage that had endured generations of repression under Tsarist rule. The Pileckis were a deeply patriotic family. Witold's grandfather had been deported to Siberia for participating in the Polish January uprising of 1863 against the Russian Empire. Resistance, sacrifice for the homeland, and the willingness to lose everything in the name of freedom. These were not abstract concepts for this family. They were part of their heritage, their blood, the education they received from the cradle. The young Witold grew up in an environment where love for Poland was inseparable from everyday life. He joined the Polish Scouting movement during his youth, an organization that in that historical context was far more than a recreational activity. Polish Scouting functioned as a school of clandestine patriotism, a space where young people learned the values of national independence at a time when Poland did not even exist as a sovereign state, divided as it was among Russia, Germany, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. When the First World War broke out in 1914, the world Witold had known crumbled. The European empires hurled themselves into unprecedented carnage, and Poland became a battlefield. For the Poles, however, the Great War also represented an opportunity. If the empires that had dismembered them fell, perhaps Poland could be reborn. And so it was. When the war ended in 1918, after more than a century of partitions, Poland re-emerged as an independent nation. It was a moment of indescribable joy for millions of Poles who had dreamed of that day for generations. But independence came, accompanied by new threats. The new republic had barely been born when it had to face the war against Bolshevik Russia between 1919 and 1921. The young Witold Pilecki, barely 18 years old, took up arms and fought in that war. He participated in the defense of Grodno, fought with valor, and experienced for the first time the horror of the battlefield. Already then, he demonstrated the qualities that would define his life: extraordinary calm under pressure, a natural capacity for leadership, and an absolute commitment to the defense of his country.
We have to make this last.
After the Polish-Soviet War, Pilecki established himself as a landowner in the Lida region, in what is now western Belarus, but was then part of Polish territory. He married Maria Ostrowska, a schoolteacher, and together they had two children, Andrzej and Zofia.
All right, gather around quickly.
Pilecki devoted himself to farming, to community life, and during the interwar years appeared to lead a quiet and productive existence. He organized agricultural cooperatives, promoted rural education, and earned the respect of his neighbors as a man of integrity, and hardworking and deeply committed to the well-being of his community. However, beneath the surface of that peaceful life, Europe was preparing for a disaster of unimaginable proportions. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had come to power in 1933, transforming the Weimar Republic into a totalitarian dictatorship that preached racial supremacy, territorial expansionism, and a virulent hatred toward everything that did not fit into its vision of the world. The Nazi Party consolidated its control over every aspect of German society with terrifying efficiency. The first concentration camps were built to imprison political opponents. Laws were enacted that stripped German Jews of their most basic rights, and a program of massive rearmament was initiated that openly violated the Treaty of Versailles. But Poland watched these events with growing unease. Situated between two totalitarian powers, Nazi Germany to the west and Stalin's Soviet Union to the east, the young Polish Republic found itself in an extremely vulnerable geopolitical position. Polish leaders tried to maintain an impossible diplomatic balance, signing non-aggression pacts with both Germany and the Soviet Union. But deep down, they knew those agreements were worthless. The question was not whether war would come, but when. The year 1939 began with unbearable tension. Hitler had annexed Austria in March of 1938, and shortly afterward had dismembered Czechoslovakia with the complicity of the Western powers in the shameful Munich Agreement. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, had returned from Munich waving a piece of paper and proclaiming he had secured peace for his generation. It was one of the most tragic and costly illusions in modern history. Hitler did not want peace. Hitler wanted the world. Throughout the spring and summer of 1939, German pressures on Poland intensified dramatically. Hitler demanded the return of the free city of Danzig and a land corridor through Polish territory, connecting Germany with East Prussia. Poland rejected these demands. The Poles knew their own history too well to believe that ceding territory to an aggressor would bring peace. They knew that any concession would simply be the prelude to new demands, until there was nothing left to concede. Then, on the 23rd of August 1939, came the news that froze the blood of Europe. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, mortal ideological enemies, had signed a non-aggression pact. The Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, as it became known by the names of the foreign ministers who signed it, included secret protocols that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland was literally split in two on a map. Hitler and Stalin had divided the country as spoils of war before a single shot had even been fired. On the 1st of September, 1939, at 4:45 in the morning, without a formal declaration of war, the German Wehrmacht crossed the Polish border. It was the beginning of the Second World War, although the world would take days to comprehend the magnitude of what had just occurred. The invasion was brutal and overwhelming. The Germans deployed an overpowering military force, armored divisions, motorized infantry, heavy artillery, and above all, the dreaded Luftwaffe, which sowed terror from the skies, bombing cities, roads packed with refugees, hospitals and churches, without any distinction. Witold Pilecki was mobilized immediately. He joined his military unit and marched to the front with the determination of a man who knew exactly what was at stake. But the reality of the battlefield was devastating. The Polish army, though it fought with extraordinary valor, was desperately outnumbered in troops, in armament, and in air capability. The German Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, was an entirely new military doctrine that combined the speed of armor with close air support and radio communications in a way no army in the world had experienced before. The Polish defenders, many of whom still relied on cavalry and First World War tactics, were overrun. Pilecki fought throughout the entire September campaign. He took part in several battles, led his men with courage, and witnessed the systematic destruction of his country. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Warsaw was bombed mercilessly for weeks. Civilians fled along crowded roads, only to be strafed from the air by Luftwaffe pilots who had orders to spread maximum terror among the population. And then, on the 17th of September, 1939, came the second blow. The Soviet Union, fulfilling the secret terms of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, invaded Poland from the east. The Polish army, already on the verge of collapse, fighting the Germans in the west, suddenly found itself trapped between two colossal enemies. The situation was utterly hopeless. There was no possibility of victory whatsoever. The Polish government fled into exile, first to Romania, and then to France, and finally to London, from where it would continue to direct the resistance throughout the war. By the 5th of October, 1939, organized military resistance had ended. Poland had fallen. The country was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union, exactly as Hitler and Stalin had agreed. It was the fourth time in history that Poland had been dismembered by its neighbors. But this time would be different.
We have to make
This time, the occupation would take on a character that surpassed anything humanity had known before. The Nazis had not invaded Poland simply to conquer territory. Their objective was far more sinister, far more radical. Hitler viewed the Poles as an inferior people, subhuman, whose function in the new Nazi order was to serve as slave labor for the Germanic master race. Polish culture was to be eliminated. The Polish intelligentsia was to be exterminated. Polish institutions were to be destroyed to their very foundations. And the Polish Jews, who constituted approximately 10% of the country's population, were destined for an even more terrible fate that no one could yet imagine in those first months of occupation. The repression began immediately. In an operation known as Action AB, the Nazis proceeded with the systematic elimination of the Polish intellectual elite. University professors, priests, teachers, lawyers, doctors, artists, journalists, military officers, community leaders, anyone who could serve as a focal point for Polish resistance was identified, arrested, and executed, or sent to concentration camps. It was a meticulously designed plan to decapitate the Polish nation, to deprive it of its leaders and of any capacity for organization. In Warsaw, life under the Nazi occupation quickly became a nightmare. A strict curfew was imposed. Street roundups became a daily occurrence. German soldiers detained people at random in the streets, in markets, in churches, and sent them to forced labor camps, or simply executed them in retaliation for any act of resistance, real or imagined. A rationing system was established that condemned the Polish population to subsistence-level nutrition, while the Germans appropriated the country's resources. And the schools were closed or converted into indoctrination institutions. The teaching of Polish history, Polish literature, and the Polish language in many contexts was forbidden. The objective was clear: to erase Poland from the face of the earth, not only as a state, but as a culture, as an identity, as a memory. But the Nazis gravely underestimated the Polish people, because beneath the surface of that brutal occupation, almost from the very first day, something extraordinary began to germinate. An underground resistance that would grow to become the largest resistance organization in all of occupied Europe. The Polish Secret Army, known by its Polish acronym Armia Krajowa, was a clandestine military organization that would eventually count hundreds of thousands of members. It operated a complete underground state, with its own judicial system, its own educational network, its own clandestine newspapers, its own intelligence structure. It was, in essence, a shadow government that kept alive the flame of Polish sovereignty, while the Nazi occupiers tried to extinguish it by force. Witold Pilecki was one of the founders of this resistance. After the military defeat of September 1939, Pilecki did not flee the country as many officers did. He did not surrender. He did not hide. Instead, he went to Warsaw and, together with Commander Jan Włodarkiewicz, founded one of the first Polish armed resistance organizations, called Tajna Armia Polska, the secret Polish army. This organization would later become part of the broader structure of the Armia Krajowa. Pilecki immersed himself fully in clandestine life. He adopted false identities, moved through Warsaw under assumed names, organized resistance cells, recruited new members, and established secure communication networks. It was extremely dangerous work. The Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, was ruthlessly efficient in hunting down resistance fighters. Any suspicion, any betrayal, any mistake could mean torture and death. The Germans took no prisoners when it came to the Polish resistance. Those captured were brutally interrogated, often for days or weeks, and then executed or sent to concentration camps where conditions were so extreme that they amounted to a slow death sentence. And it was precisely in this context that disturbing rumors reached the ears of the Polish resistance about a place called Auschwitz. In the spring of 1940, the Nazis had established a new concentration camp on the outskirts of the Polish city of Oświęcim, which the Germans had rechristened with the Germanized name Auschwitz. The first reports were fragmentary and confused, but they all agreed on one thing: conditions in that place were of an unprecedented brutality, even by the already inhuman standards of the Nazi occupation. The resistance leaders in Warsaw needed reliable information. They needed to know what was truly happening behind the barbed wire of Auschwitz. They needed an agent inside the camp, someone who could observe, document, and transmit information to the outside world. But sending someone into a Nazi concentration camp meant condemning them to unimaginable suffering, possibly to death. It was not a mission that could be ordered. It had to be voluntary. And then Witold Pilecki stepped forward. What he proposed was so audacious, so unprecedented, so apparently suicidal, that at first his superiors could not believe what they were hearing. Pilecki volunteered to infiltrate Auschwitz. This was not about entering with a false identity as a guard or a civilian employee. No. Pilecki was offering to let himself be captured by the Nazis, to be sent to Auschwitz as a prisoner, to survive in the camp for as long as necessary, to build a clandestine resistance network within the camp's walls. to gather information about the atrocities being committed there, and to transmit that information to the outside world. In other words, Pilecki was offering to voluntarily enter what was already known to be one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Let us pause for a moment to consider what that meant. In 1940, the Nazi concentration camps were already known as places of extreme horror. Prisoners were subjected to exhausting forced labor, constant beatings, and a diet insufficient to keep a human being alive. Diseases spread unchecked. Executions were arbitrary and frequent. To voluntarily enter that hell required a kind of courage that goes beyond what most of us can even conceive. It was not the courage of a moment, the bravery that surges in the heat of battle when adrenaline overrides fear. It was a cold, calculated, conscious courage. Pilecki knew exactly what he was facing, and he chose to go anyway. His superiors in the resistance, after recovering from their initial shock, approved the plan. They provided him with a false identity, an identification card in the name of Tomasz Serafiński, and a name Pilecki would carry throughout his entire stay in the camp. They gave him instructions about what kind of information he should gather, the number of prisoners, the conditions of the camp, the German command structure, the possibilities of organizing an internal resistance, and any other data that might be useful to the Allies or to the Polish resistance. The plan was simple in conception, though terrifyingly risky in execution. The Nazis conducted periodic roundups in Warsaw, mass capture operations known as łapanki. German soldiers would cordon off a street or an entire neighborhood and detain all men of military age they found. The detainees were sent to forced labor camps or concentration camps. Pilecki simply had to be in the right place at the right time and let himself be caught. On the 19th of September, 1940, Witold Pilecki said goodbye to his resistance comrades. We do not know exactly what words they exchanged, but we can imagine the gravity of that moment. Pilecki knew that perhaps he would never return. He knew he was walking into the unknown, toward a suffering whose magnitude he could only guess at. But he also knew that someone had to do it, and he had decided that someone would be him. That morning, Pilecki went out onto the streets of Warsaw. He headed to an area where he knew the Germans usually conducted roundups, and he waited. He did not have to wait long. The German soldiers appeared shortly afterward, cordoned off the area, and began detaining the men they found in their path. Pilecki was one of them. He raised his hands when a rifle was pointed at him. He showed his false documentation when it was demanded, and he was dragged along with hundreds of other men toward a destination that most of them could not imagine. The detainees were first taken to an improvised concentration point, probably a barracks or a school requisitioned by the Germans. There they were registered, briefly interrogated, and classified. Pilecki, under his false identity of Tomasz Serafiński, was assigned to the group that would be sent to Auschwitz. The process was mechanical, bureaucratic, devoid of any humanity. For the Nazis, those men were not people. They were numbers, units of labor, human material from which to extract every last drop of usefulness before discarding them.
Until the thaw.
The transport to Auschwitz was carried out in cattle cars. Dozens of men were crammed into each car, with no room to sit, no water, no food, no latrines. The journey lasted endless hours.
I got you, Witold.
The air inside the cars became unbreathable. The heat, the stench, the thirst, the fear. Some men prayed quietly, others wept. Others remained in a stunned silence, unable to process what was happening to them. Pilecki, in the midst of that human chaos, maintained his composure. He observed. He listened. He memorized. He was already working. When the train finally stopped and the car doors were opened, The prisoners were greeted by the shouts of SS guards and the furious barking of German shepherd dogs. The daylight blinded them after the hours of darkness in the cars. The guards ordered them down with blows, shoves, and kicks. Those who did not move quickly enough were struck with rifle butts or bitten by the dogs. The first thing Pilecki saw upon arriving at Auschwitz was the camp's main gate, and with its infamous inscription wrought in iron, Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. It was a lie so cruel, so cynical, that it is difficult to find words to describe it, because the freedom that awaited most of those who crossed that gate was not the one the inscription promised. The only freedom they would find would be the freedom of death. Auschwitz, in those first months of its existence, was a place designed to destroy human beings. Not with the industrial efficiency that would come later, with the gas chambers and crematoria that would turn the camp into a factory of death, unprecedented in history. In 1940, Auschwitz was still primarily a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners, and the method of extermination was more primitive but equally devastating. Slave labor, starvation, disease, beatings, and executions. It was a slow, cruel death, designed to wring every last drop of life from each prisoner before discarding them as one discards a broken object. The intake process at the camp was in itself an act of calculated psychological destruction. New prisoners were stripped of everything they possessed: their clothes, their personal belongings, their documents, their hair. Their identity was literally torn away. In return, they received a striped uniform that was rarely their size, a pair of wooden clogs that destroyed their feet, and a number that was tattooed on their left forearm, and that from that moment on replaced their name. They were no longer people. They were numbers. Pilecki received the number 4,859. The SS guards who controlled the camp were, for the most part, men who had been carefully selected and trained for their task. They were not simple soldiers. They were ideological fanatics who had been indoctrinated in the belief that the prisoners they guarded were inferior beings, subhumans, unworthy of the slightest consideration. Many of them took pleasure in the suffering they inflicted. Beatings were constant and could be triggered by any reason or by none. A prisoner who did not remove his cap quickly enough when passing a guard could be beaten unconscious. One who failed to maintain perfect formation during the endless roll calls could be executed on the spot as an example to the others. The camp commandant was Rudolf Höss, a man who would come to personify the banality of evil in a chilling manner. Höss administered Auschwitz with the efficiency of a corporate bureaucrat, speaking of production quotas and mortality rates with the same coldness with which a factory manager would discuss labor performance and operating costs. Under his command, the camp functioned as a perfectly oiled machine whose purpose was the systematic degradation and destruction of human beings. Pilecki's first days in Auschwitz were a baptism of fire. Nothing could have prepared him for the reality of the camp, not even his military experience, not even the warnings he had received before entering. The violence was omnipresent, constant, arbitrary. Prisoners were woken at 4:30 in the morning, forced to stand for hours in the camp's central yard to be counted, and then sent to forced labor, lasting between 10 and 12 hours a day. The work was deliberately exhausting, hauling quarry stones, digging ditches, building new barracks for the prisoners who kept arriving in ever-growing waves. Those who could not keep up the pace were beaten. Those who fell were abandoned or finished off. The food was a cruel mockery. Prisoners received a piece of black bread in the morning, often moldy or mixed with sawdust, and a bowl of watery soup at midday that contained barely any nutritional substance. The rations were calculated to keep the prisoners alive just long enough to extract the maximum labor from them, but not to sustain them in the long term. It was a diabolical equation. Feed just enough so they could work, but not enough so they could survive indefinitely. The result was predictable and devastating. Prisoners lost weight rapidly. Their bodies wasted away. Their immune systems collapsed. Within weeks, men who had arrived at the camp healthy and strong became shadows of themselves, walking skeletons with skin clinging to bones and a vacant stare that reflected the progressive extinction of all hope. Diseases spread unchecked. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, tuberculosis. The barracks were overcrowded, poorly ventilated, without adequate heating in winter. Prisoners slept crammed into 3-tiered wooden bunks, often sharing a blanket among several. The latrines were insufficient and unsanitary. The conditions were a perfect breeding ground for epidemics, and when these erupted, the sick rarely received medical attention. The camp hospital existed more as an instrument of experimentation and selection than as a place of healing. And prisoners too sick to work were considered useless and were frequently eliminated with lethal injections of phenol directly into the heart.
I got you, Witold.
The Polish winter was another deadly enemy. Temperatures could drop to 20 or 30 degrees below zero, and the prisoners, dressed in their thin striped uniforms and wooden clogs, worked outdoors for hours with no protection against the cold. Frostbite was a common ailment. Many prisoners lost fingers from their hands or toes from their feet. Others simply collapsed in the snow and never got up again. The SS guards, bundled in their thick military coats, watched these sufferings with indifference or with amusement. And in the midst of all that horror, Witold Pilecki was not only surviving, but had begun to work. Because he was not in Auschwitz as a passive victim of the system, and he was there with a mission. And that mission gave him something that most prisoners did not have: a purpose. A reason to keep going when everything seemed to indicate that surrender was the only rational option. From his very first days in the camp, Pilecki began to observe with the eyes of a spy. He studied the layout of the camp, the guards' routines, the schedules of roll calls, patrol routes, blind spots in the surveillance. He memorized the names of SS officers, their ranks, their functions. He identified the weaknesses in the security system, the moments when vigilance relaxed, the opportunities that might be exploited. Every detail, every observation was stored in his memory with the precision of a trained intelligence professional. But the most important task, and the most dangerous, was building a clandestine resistance network within the camp. Pilecki knew he could not do it alone. He needed allies, men he could trust absolutely, men willing to risk their lives, lives already in constant danger, for the cause of resistance. And he needed to be extraordinarily cautious. A single mistake, a single indiscretion, a single informer, and not only he, but everyone connected to him would be discovered, tortured, and executed. The recruitment process was slow, meticulous, and extremely risky. Pilecki began by approaching prisoners he had known before the war, or who had been recommended to him by trusted contacts. He sounded them out carefully, evaluating their character, their reliability, their psychological resilience. It was not enough for someone to hate the Nazis or wish to resist, and they had to be someone capable of keeping a secret under the most extreme circumstances imaginable, someone who could endure torture without talking, someone whose commitment was unbreakable. Little by little, cell by cell, Pilecki built what he called the military organization of the Union, known by its Polish acronym as ZOU. The structure was deliberately fragmented. Each member knew only the other members of their own cell, not the organization as a whole. In this way, if someone was captured and interrogated, the damage would be limited. They could not reveal what they did not know.
I got you, Witold.
It was the basic principle of every clandestine organization, but implementing it under the conditions of Auschwitz, where distrust was a tool of survival and betrayal a constant temptation, and was a feat of organization and leadership that defies imagination. Pilecki's network grew gradually. By the end of 1941, the ZOU had hundreds of members distributed across the different work commandos in the camp. Pilecki had managed to infiltrate his men into strategic positions in the camp kitchen, where they could divert small amounts of additional food to keep the weakest members of the organization alive. In the hospital, where they could protect the sick from the deadly selections and obtain medications. In the workshops, where they had access to tools and materials. Even in the camp's administrative offices, where they could access valuable information about Nazi operations. The work of the ZOU was multifaceted. First, the organization worked to improve the survival conditions of its members and other prisoners. This could mean something as simple as securing an extra ration of bread for a man on the verge of starvation, or something as complex as arranging the transfer of a sick prisoner to a less strenuous work commando. In an environment where every calorie, every minute of rest, every small advantage could mean the difference between life and death, these interventions were not trivial. They were profoundly meaningful acts of resistance. Second, the organization functioned as an intelligence network. ZOU members gathered information about everything happening in the camp, the number of prisoners arriving and dying, the methods of execution employed, the identities of the most cruel guards, the camp's expansion plans, the conditions of the different blocks and commandos. And all this information was compiled by Pilecki into detailed reports that had to be transmitted to the outside world. The third objective, and perhaps the most ambitious, was to prepare the ground for a possible armed uprising within the camp. Pilecki dreamed of a scenario in which the prisoners, organized and coordinated, could rise against their captors at the opportune moment, preferably in coordination with an external attack by the Polish resistance or Allied forces. It was a desperately optimistic plan, but Pilecki believed it was necessary to keep that hope alive among the prisoners. Hope in Auschwitz was the most valuable and scarcest resource of all. The methods used to transmit information out of the camp were ingenious and extraordinarily risky. Yet the main communication channel was through prisoners who worked in external commandos, that is, work groups that left the camp during the day to work in factories, farms, or construction projects in the surrounding area. Some of these prisoners had contact, however brief and dangerous, with Polish civilians on the outside. Through these contacts, coded messages written on tiny scraps of paper could be passed from hand to hand until they reached agents of the Polish resistance operating in the area. Another method involved prisoners who worked in the camp laundry or carpentry workshop. Messages could be hidden in dirty laundry sent outside the camp for washing, or in furniture and other objects manufactured in the workshops. Poles who worked outside the camp as forced civilian laborers also served as intermediaries. And in extremely risky cases, prisoners who pretended to be dead were carried out of the camp on the carts that transported corpses to the mass graves or the primitive crematoria that existed at that time. Each of these methods was extremely dangerous. If a message was intercepted, not only the messenger, but the entire transmission chain could be exposed. The consequences would be torture and death for all involved. Nevertheless, the system worked. Throughout 1941 and 1942, Pilecki managed to send a series of reports that reached the Polish resistance in Warsaw, and from there, the Polish government in exile in London. These reports were extraordinary documents. Pilecki described with clinical precision the conditions of the camp, the treatment of prisoners, the methods of execution, the organizational structure of the SS, and the general functioning of the Nazi death machinery. His reports were among the first direct and detailed testimonies of what was happening in the Nazi concentration camps. At a time when the outside world could barely imagine the scale of the crimes being committed in places like Auschwitz, Pilecki's reports provided concrete, verifiable, irrefutable evidence. But transmitting the reports was only half the challenge. The other half was surviving. Because daily life in Auschwitz was a constant battle against death, a fight waged every hour, every minute, every second. Pilecki was not exempt from the horrors suffered by all prisoners. He starved like them. He worked to exhaustion like them. He endured the cold, the beatings, the constant humiliations like them. Among the difference was that he also carried the additional weight of his secret mission, a burden he could not share with most of the prisoners around him. There are episodes from Pilecki's time in Auschwitz that illustrate both the horror of the camp and the determination of the man. In one of his reports, Pilecki described how SS guards forced prisoners to perform grueling exercises in freezing rain until several of them collapsed and died of hypothermia and exhaustion. He described how prisoners were hung from posts with their arms twisted behind their backs, a form of torture that dislocated the shoulders and caused unbearable pain. He described how the sick were periodically selected and sent to die, whether by lethal injection, deliberate starvation, or in the first gas experiments the Nazis began conducting from 1941 onward. Because it was at Auschwitz that the Nazis began to perfect their machinery of industrial extermination. In September of 1941, the first test of mass gassing using Zyklon B, a pesticide based on hydrogen cyanide, was carried out. 600 Soviet prisoners of war and 250 sick prisoners were locked in the basement of Block 11 and gassed to death. It was the beginning of something that would surpass the worst fears of any rational mind. The Nazis had found a method of mass killing with an efficiency that no other form of execution could match. Pilecki witnessed the exponential growth of the camp's extermination capacity. He watched as new facilities were constructed, as increasingly numerous transports arrived, as the camp expanded to accommodate a prisoner population growing at a dizzying pace. And he observed something that chilled his blood in a way different from anything he had experienced before. The massive arrival of entire Jewish families, men, women, elderly and children, who were led directly from the trains to the gas chambers without even going through the registration process as prisoners. They disappeared without a trace, their names not even recorded, as if they had never existed. Pilecki's reports about these atrocities became increasingly urgent, increasingly desperate. He described what he saw in the hope that someone in the outside world would act, that the Allies would bomb the railway lines, carrying transports to Auschwitz, that someone would do something, anything, to stop that massacre. But the responses he received from outside were disheartening. The Polish resistance transmitted his reports to London, but the Allies seemed unable or unwilling to act. The reasons were multiple and complex. Initial skepticism about the veracity of the reports, which seemed too horrible to be true. Military priorities that made it difficult to justify diverting resources for a rescue operation. Political calculations that prioritized overall military victory over the salvation of individual victims. Whatever the reason, help did not come. Inside the camp, Pilecki's situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. The SS had begun to suspect that some kind of clandestine organization existed among the prisoners. Interrogations, surprise searches, and surveillance intensified. Several ZUW members were discovered and executed. At each loss was a devastating blow, not only operational, but also personal. Pilecki knew those men, had worked with them, had entrusted his life to them, and they had entrusted theirs to him. And now they were dead. The danger of being discovered hung over Pilecki like a permanent shadow. He knew the Gestapo was tightening the noose, that it was only a matter of time before someone talked under torture and revealed his role as leader of the internal resistance. Every day that passed without being discovered was a small victory, but also an increasingly risky gamble. Throughout 1942, Pilecki continued his work with a determination that bordered on the superhuman. He reorganized the network when necessary, replaced lost members, adapted tactics to new security conditions. He continued sending reports to the outside, ever more detailed, ever more urgent. And he continued keeping alive the hope of an armed uprising, even though conditions for such an enterprise seemed increasingly impossible. Daily life in Auschwitz during this period was marked by a routine of horror that had become, in a terrible way, almost normal. The prisoners had adapted to the extent it was possible to adapt to the unadaptable. They had learned the unwritten rules of survival. Never stand out, never attract the guards' attention, never appear too weak or too strong, never show emotions, never trust anyone completely. They had learned to calculate every movement, every word, every gesture in terms of its implications for survival. It was an existence reduced to its most primitive expression. Staying alive one more day, one more hour, one more minute. The roll calls were one of the most dreaded moments of the day. Twice daily, morning and evening, all prisoners had to form in perfect rows in the camp's central yard to be counted. The process could last hours, especially if the numbers did not add up. Prisoners stood motionless under the scorching summer sun or the glacial winter cold, while SS guards walked the rows, counting again and again. If a prisoner collapsed during roll call, they were beaten or dragged out of formation. If a prisoner had escaped or hidden, the roll call could be extended for additional hours as collective punishment, with prisoners standing until some literally died of exhaustion and exposure. Inside the barracks, life was a mixture of extreme overcrowding, filth, disease, and constant psychological tension. Prisoners slept in wooden bunks stacked 3 high, often 4 or 5 men per bunk. Blankets were scarce and infested with lice. Rats ran along the aisles between the bunks. The stench was unbearable, a mixture of sweat, disease, excrement, and something more, something indefinable. That was the smell of human despair, concentrated in a closed space. But even in that hell, humanity found ways to manifest itself. Pilecki observed and documented countless acts of kindness among the prisoners. A man who shared his miserable bread ration with another who was weaker. A prisoner doctor who risked his life to treat the sick with the scarce resources available. A group of prisoners who protected a sick comrade by hiding him during selections. These acts of solidarity were not grand heroics. They were small lights in an absolute darkness, and Pilecki considered them proof that not even Auschwitz could completely destroy the best of the human spirit. Pilecki's organization also played an important role in maintaining morale. ZOE members shared news from the outside when they obtained it, usually through clandestine contacts with the Polish resistance. knowing that the outside world had not forgotten them, that the war continued, and that the possibility of future liberation existed, was nourishment for the soul, as necessary as bread was for the body.
Until the thaw.
Pilecki also organized small clandestine ceremonies to commemorate Polish holidays, moments of connection with a national identity that the Nazis were trying to erase. One of the most remarkable aspects of Pilecki's network was its ability to operate in an environment specifically designed to prevent any form of organization. The Nazis had created a surveillance system that used the prisoners themselves as instruments of control. The capos, prisoners who were assigned authority over other prisoners in exchange for privileges, were often as brutal as the SS guards themselves. Many capos were common German criminal prisoners who had been selected precisely for their willingness to commit violence. They acted as the eyes and ears of the SSS inside the barracks, and any prisoner suspected of clandestine activity could be reported by a capo at any moment. Pilecki had to navigate this labyrinth of surveillance with extraordinary skill. He learned to read people with almost supernatural precision, to distinguish those who could be trusted from those who were potential informers. He learned to communicate in codes, in gestures, in meaningful silences. He learned to dissemble, to appear as just another prisoner among thousands, a broken and subjugated man who posed no threat. And meanwhile, beneath that mask of submission, he kept weaving his network, kept gathering information, kept fighting. As the year 1942 progressed, the nature of the camp changed dramatically. What had begun as a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners was being transformed into the epicenter of the most systematic and efficient extermination program in history. The final solution, the Nazi plan for the total extermination of European Jews, was entering its most intense phase, and Auschwitz had become its primary instrument. New facilities were built at Birkenau, a subcamp located about 3 kilometers from the main camp. Birkenau, also known as Auschwitz II, and was designed specifically for mass extermination. Enormous gas chambers disguised as showers and crematoria, capable of incinerating thousands of bodies per day, were constructed. Transports of Jews arrived from all over Europe, from Hungary, from Greece, from France, from Holland, from Belgium, from Italy, from every corner of the continent. Most of those who arrived on these transports never formally entered the camp. They were led directly from the train ramps to the gas chambers and murdered within hours of their arrival. Pilecki, who had already witnessed atrocities that surpassed all comprehension, found himself confronting something that exceeded even his capacity to absorb. The numbers were so enormous, the process so mechanical, so devoid of any human emotion, that it was almost impossible to process rationally. Thousands of people, entire families with their suitcases, their photographs, their memories, their hopes, were transformed into ash within hours. The smoke from the crematoria rose constantly over the camp, and a sweet, nauseating smell permeated the air for kilometers around. Everyone in the camp knew what that smoke, that smell, meant, and no one could do anything to stop it. In his reports to the outside, Pilecki included increasingly detailed descriptions of this process of industrial extermination. He provided estimates of the number of victims being killed daily, described the functioning of the gas chambers and crematoria, and begged the Allies to act. His reports were transmitted to London through the Polish Resistance Network, and they constitute some of the most important documents about the Holocaust produced during the war. But the response from the outside world remained insufficient. The Allies received the reports, analyzed them, discussed them in high-level meetings, and filed them away. There were operational reasons for not acting. The railway lines leading to Auschwitz were beyond the range of Allied bombers for much of the war. An air attack on the camp risked killing thousands of prisoners. There was no viable plan for a ground rescue at such a distance from the Allied front lines. But there were also less justifiable reasons. A persistent incredulity about the magnitude of the reported crimes, a lack of political will to prioritize the rescue of civilians over conventional military objectives, and perhaps, in some cases, an indifference that history would judge severely. For Pilecki, the Allied failure to respond was one of the most bitter experiences of his entire stay in Auschwitz. He had risked everything, had suffered the unspeakable, to transmit information that could save lives. And that information was being received, read, understood, but was not provoking the action he considered necessary and urgent. It was like screaming in a sealed room. The walls returned the echo, but no one on the other side bothered to open the door. Yet Pilecki did not give up. Not before the horrors of the camp. Not before the indifference of the outside world. Not before the ever-growing danger he faced. He continued his work with a tenacity that is difficult to comprehend from the comfort of our historical perspective. He kept organizing, recruiting, reporting. He remained a beacon of resistance in an ocean of suffering. The years 1942 and 1943 brought significant changes in the panorama of the war that had direct repercussions on the situation inside Auschwitz. The German defeat at Stalingrad in February of 1943 marked a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. For the first time, the invincibility of the Wehrmacht had been disproven unequivocally. The news reached Auschwitz through the Zau's clandestine channels, and its effect on prisoner morale was electrifying. If the Germans could be defeated at Stalingrad, perhaps they could be defeated everywhere. Perhaps the nightmare had an expiration date. But Pilecki was too much of a realist to be swept away by unfounded optimism. He knew the war was far from over, and that the situation inside the camp was deteriorating rapidly. The SS had intensified their efforts to discover and eliminate any form of organized resistance. Several ZUW members had been arrested and executed in the preceding weeks. The network was under unprecedented pressure, and Pilecki knew his time in the camp was running out. It was in this context that Pilecki made the decision that would change the course of his personal history. After nearly 3 years inside Auschwitz, years of unimaginable suffering, of constant danger, of incessant clandestine work, Pilecki concluded that his usefulness inside the camp had reached its limit. The network he had built could continue functioning without him. The reports to the outside would continue flowing through the established channels. But there was something that only he could do from the outside. Personally convince the resistance leaders and the Allies of the urgent need to act against Auschwitz. Pilecki believed that if he could sit face to face with Allied commanders and tell them what he had seen, if he could convey the urgency of the situation with the authority of a direct witness, perhaps they would finally be moved to act. There was another reason, less noble but profoundly human, for his decision. Pilecki was exhausted. Nearly 3 years of Auschwitz had taken their toll on his body and spirit in a way that even his iron will could not entirely deny. He had survived typhus, pneumonia, countless beatings, a cold and hunger that would have killed younger and stronger men. His body was devastated, and he knew that if he stayed in the camp much longer, his luck would eventually run out. We must pause for a moment to understand the psychological magnitude of what Pilecki experienced during those interminable months inside Auschwitz. It was not enough to survive physically, although that alone was an almost miraculous feat. One had to survive mentally, emotionally, spiritually. One had to maintain intact the ability to think clearly, to plan, to evaluate risks, to make rational decisions, in an environment specifically designed to destroy the human mind as much as the body. Psychologists who have subsequently studied human behavior under extreme conditions have noted that most people, subjected to the kind of sustained stress that existed in Auschwitz, experience psychological collapse within weeks or months. The human mind is not designed to process continuous and inescapable trauma of that magnitude. Psychological defense mechanisms activate dissociation, emotional numbing, apathy, inner surrender. Many concentration camp prisoners described a state that the inmates themselves called being a Mussulman, using that term not in a religious sense, but as camp slang to describe a prisoner who had lost all will to live, who had become an automaton, who walked, obeyed orders, and awaited death with the passivity of someone who had already ceased to be a person. Pilecki not only avoided that fate, but functioned at an extraordinarily high level for nearly 3 years. He maintained multiple simultaneous mental identities. He was Tomasz Serafiński, the prisoner, obedient and submissive before the guards. He was the secret leader of the ZOO, calculating and strategic with his agents. He was the observer and chronicler, memorizing data and details with the precision of a photographic camera. And he was, in some deep corner of his being, still Witold Pilecki, husband and father, Polish patriot, a human being who felt pain, fear, and loneliness like any other. The ability to keep all these facets integrated, to function coherently at all these simultaneous levels, reveals a psychological strength that is almost incomprehensible. There were moments, as he would later hint at in his subsequent writings, when the mask nearly cracked. Moments when the horror he witnessed threatened to overwhelm his capacity for containment. Moments when the death of a close companion or the sight of a particularly monstrous atrocity made him feel he could not go on for even one more second. But he went on. He always went on. He found somewhere within himself a reserve of strength that allowed him to get up once more, breathe once more, take one more step toward the next day. This aspect of Pilecki's story deserves particular reflection because it tells us something profound about the nature of heroism. Heroism is not the absence of fear. It is not immunity to suffering. It is not a superhuman invulnerability to pain and despair. Heroism, as Pilecki embodied it, is the conscious decision to keep fighting despite the fear, despite the suffering, despite the despair. It is the refusal to surrender, when surrender would be the most logical, most understandable, most human option. It is choosing resistance when the entire universe conspires to impose submission. And that same determination he demonstrated not only inside Auschwitz, but at every subsequent stage of his life. During the planning of the escape, when any rational calculation suggested the odds of success were minimal. During the journey through the occupied Polish countryside, when every shadow could be a German soldier and every sound could be a tracking dog. During the months of writing his report, when reliving the horrors of Auschwitz through writing was almost as painful as having lived them. During the Warsaw Uprising, when he fought in the streets of a city crumbling around him. And during the interrogations by the communist secret police, when he endured tortures that would have broken any less extraordinary man. There is a detail from Pilecki's final days that is particularly moving. Before his execution, he was allowed to write one last letter to his wife, Maria. The exact content of that letter has been lost to history, but the fragments that have survived reveal a man who, even on the brink of death, thought more of others than of himself. There was no bitterness in his words, no self-pity, no reproach. Only love for his family, concern for the future of his children, and an unshakable faith that Poland would someday be free. Maria Pilecki, his wife, survived her husband by many years. She lived under the communist regime, knowing that her husband was a hero, but unable to say so aloud. She raised their two children, Andrzej and Zofia, silently transmitting to them the truth about their father that the official world was trying to erase. It was a different form of heroism, quieter and more prolonged, but no less real. Keeping alive the memory of a man the state wanted forgotten required a daily courage that we should not underestimate. Pilecki's children grew up bearing the weight of an extraordinary legacy and the frustration of being unable to publicly claim it. Andrzej Pilecki dedicated much of his adult life to recovering his father's memory, collecting documents, testimonies, and any fragment of information that could preserve the truth. Zofia likewise kept the flame of remembrance alive. When freedom finally came to Poland, both were at last able to speak openly about their father, and the story they told astonished the world. Let us also think of Pilecki's companions, the men and women of the ZOW, who risked, and in many cases, lost their lives as part of the resistance network he built in Auschwitz. Their names are less well known, their stories less documented, but their courage was no less. Every member of the organization knew that if discovered, death would be the most merciful outcome they could expect. Torture would come first, long and merciless, designed to extract the names of other members of the network. And yet, hundreds of prisoners chose to join the organization, chose to resist, chose to fight under the most adverse conditions imaginable. Among them were men of every profession and background: doctors, lawyers, teachers, workers, farmers, artists, priests. Resistance within Auschwitz was not the province of any social class or profession. It was a fundamental human impulse, the instinctive refusal of the human spirit to be completely crushed, even when circumstances made resistance seem not only futile but suicidal. The reports Pilecki sent from Auschwitz and the comprehensive report he wrote after his escape were not merely military intelligence documents. They were acts of testimony. They were the voice of the voiceless, the cry of those being silenced forever. Every datum, every figure, every description was an act of defiance against the Nazi machinery of secrecy and denial. The Nazis knew that what they were doing was monstrous, and that is why they worked so hard to conceal it. The crematoria at Birkenau were surrounded by trees, planted specifically to block the view from outside. Official documents used euphemisms to refer to the extermination. The prisoners who worked in the gas chambers were periodically murdered to prevent them from being able to testify. Secrecy was a fundamental pillar of the Nazi extermination system. And against that secrecy, against that wall of silence and denial, rose the voice of Witold Pilecki. A single man, armed only with his memory and his determination, who managed to get the truth to the outside world. That this truth was not enough to provoke immediate action does not in any way diminish the magnitude of what he accomplished. The information was there, available, verifiable. If the leaders of the free world chose not to act upon it, the responsibility for that inaction falls on them, not on the messenger who risked everything to deliver it. When we think of Auschwitz today, we tend to think of it as an abstract symbol of absolute evil. But for Witold Pilecki, it was not a symbol. It was a real place, with real smells, with real sounds, with a real cold that penetrated the bones, and a real hunger that left room for no other thought. It was a place where real men suffered and died every day, where real families were destroyed within hours, where the most refined cruelty and the most glacial indifference combined to create something that human language cannot fully describe. Pilecki lived through all of that. He lived it not as an external observer, but as a participant, as a prisoner, as a victim. He suffered everything that the other prisoners suffered. And in addition, he bore the extra responsibility of documenting it all, of remembering it all, of transmitting it all. He was simultaneously victim and witness, prisoner and spy, a man who suffered, and a man who recorded the suffering of others. That duality must have been a crushing psychological burden. And yet, when we read his reports, what surprises us is not the despair, but the clarity, not the chaos, but the order. Pilecki wrote with a precision that reveals an extraordinarily disciplined mind, capable of maintaining objectivity even when describing the most appalling horrors. That clarity was not coldness or insensitivity. It was professionalism in its purest expression, the ability to separate emotions from the task at the precise moment when that separation was necessary for the task to be fulfilled. There is something deeply moving in the image of a man sitting in an Auschwitz barracks, surrounded by suffering and death, writing in tiny script on scraps of paper that had to be small enough to be hidden and clandestinely transmitted, describing with clinical precision the horrors he witnessed every day. And there is something in that image that captures the very essence of what it means to resist, of what it means to refuse to be reduced to total powerlessness, of what it means to maintain one's humanity when everything conspires to destroy it. The story of Witold Pilecki is ultimately a story about the power of individual choice. In a world where enormous and impersonal forces, armies, ideologies, bureaucracies, systems of terror, seem to determine the fate of millions of people, one man decided he would not be a passive victim. He decided to act. He decided that his life would have a purpose beyond mere survival. And in making that decision, he demonstrated something that tyrants of every age have tried to deny: that the individual human spirit is stronger than any system designed to crush it. And Auschwitz was built to destroy human beings. It was designed with diabolical meticulousness to strip every person who crossed its gates of everything that made them human: their name, their dignity, their identity, their hope, and finally, their life. And to a great extent, it fulfilled its terrible purpose. More than 1 million people perished in Auschwitz and its subcamps. 1 million lives, each of them a complete universe of memories, dreams, loves, and possibilities, extinguished in the most systematic horror humanity has ever produced. But Auschwitz did not succeed in destroying Witold Pilecki. It did not succeed in destroying his determination, his courage, his humanity. It did not succeed in turning him into a number, though they tattooed one on his arm. It did not succeed in breaking his spirit, though it subjected his body to torments that would have destroyed anyone else. Pilecki entered Auschwitz as a free man, and he left Auschwitz as a free man. Free not in the physical sense, for he spent years as a prisoner, but free in the deepest and most important sense. Free in his mind, free in his spirit, free in his unbreakable refusal to submit to tyranny. That is perhaps the most powerful lesson of his story, that the ultimate freedom, the freedom no tyrant can take away, is the freedom to choose who we want to be in the face of the most extreme circumstances. Witold Pilecki chose to be brave when cowardice would have been easier. He chose to be faithful to his principles when betrayal would have been safer. He chose to be human when inhumanity surrounded him on every side. And that choice, repeated day after day, hour after hour, through years of unbearable suffering, is what makes his story more than a historical account. It makes it a permanent testament to the best that the human spirit can be. And that testament continues to resonate today with an urgency that the passage of time has not diminished but increased. In a world where new forms of tyranny threaten freedom and human dignity, where indifference to the suffering of others remains a constant temptation, where truth is often the first casualty of political ambition, the story of Witold Pilecki reminds us that the possibility of choosing differently always exists, that a single individual can make a difference, that courage, truth, and humanity never lose their power, even when all seems lost. Witold Pilecki did not save Auschwitz, and he could not prevent the extermination of more than 1 million innocent people. He failed to convince the Allies to act in time. He did not win freedom for his country. He was executed by the regime that should have honored him, and his memory was erased for decades by those who feared the truth he represented.
You missed!
In many respects, Pilecki's story is a story of failure.
I got you, Witold.
But it is a failure so noble, so righteous, so profoundly human, that it shines with a brighter light than many triumphs. Because what defines a man is not always the outcome of his actions, but the nature of his choices. And the choices of Witold Pilecki were, without exception, those of a man who preferred light to darkness, truth to lies, duty to comfort, and freedom to life itself. His story deserves to be told. It deserves to be heard. It deserves to be remembered. Not as a relic of the past, but as a compass for the present and a warning for the future. Because as long as men like Witold Pilecki exist in the collective memory of humanity, there will exist proof that the best of us can prevail over the worst, even in the darkest moments of our history. The decision to escape was not taken lightly. Escaping from Auschwitz was an enterprise that most prisoners considered impossible, and with good reason. The camp was surrounded by multiple security perimeters, electrified barbed wire, watchtowers with machine guns, guard patrols with dogs, ditches, and minefields. Beyond the camp's immediate perimeter, the SS maintained a security zone, extending several kilometers in every direction, where any unauthorized person was detained immediately. The civilian population of surrounding villages had been warned that anyone who helped a fugitive would be executed along with their entire family. And when a prisoner escaped, the SS deployed a massive search operation that included soldiers, tracking dogs, and reconnaissance aircraft, while the prisoners remaining in the camp were subjected to brutal collective punishments that could include hours of standing outdoors, reduced food rations, and the random selection of prisoners to be executed in reprisal. Despite all these obstacles, some prisoners had managed to escape. The cases were few, but sufficient to demonstrate that it was not absolutely impossible. Pilecki meticulously studied every escape attempt he learned of, both successful and failed, analyzing the factors that had determined the success or failure of each one. From this analysis emerged a plan that, while far from foolproof, offered a reasonable chance of success. The plan involved 3 men: Pilecki himself, Jan Redzej, and Edward Ciesielski. All 3 were ZOE members and had been carefully selected for the mission. Redzej was a robust and determined man, whose military experience made him an ideal companion for a high-risk operation. Ciesielski brought technical knowledge and a cool head that would prove invaluable during the escape. Together, the three formed a small but capable team.
We have to make
The
this
opportunity
last
presented
until the
itself
fall.
thanks to the work assignment of the three men. Pilecki and his companions had managed to be assigned to the camp bakery, a commando that worked in a building situated just inside the outer perimeter of the camp. The bakery operated at night, and which meant that the prisoners assigned to it had a certain freedom of movement during the dark hours, a crucial advantage for any escape attempt. The plan was relatively simple in conception. They would take advantage of a moment when surveillance relaxed during the night, force open a back door of the bakery that led to the outside of the camp, cut the telephone lines to delay the alarm, and flee through the darkness toward the surrounding fields and forests. Once beyond the camp's immediate perimeter, they would have to cover as much distance as possible before dawn, when the guards would discover their absence and launch the pursuit. The preparations were meticulous. During the weeks preceding the escape, the three men accumulated small quantities of food they could carry with them. Pieces of bread, a few sugar cubes, anything they could hide without arousing suspicion. They also prepared civilian clothes they had obtained through the clandestine network, garments that would allow them to pass as Polish workers once they moved away from the camp. And most importantly, Pilecki carried with him, hidden among his clothes, documents summarizing the most critical information he had gathered during his nearly 3 years in Auschwitz. The chosen night was that of the 26th to 27th of April, 1943. It was an Easter night, a detail that was no coincidence. Pilecki hoped that the Easter celebrations would reduce the guards' vigilance, that they might be distracted or relaxed. It was a calculated gamble, like everything Pilecki did. When the hour came, the three men moved with the precision of a military operation. First, they waited for the bakery guard to complete his nightly round and move away. Then, with hands trembling not from fear, but from adrenaline and tension, they opened the back door of the building. Pilecki's heart beat with such force that he feared the guards might hear it. Every creak, every shadow, every sound in the night was amplified in his consciousness, as if someone had turned up the volume of the world. Jan Redze was the first to go out. He slipped through the door like a shadow, moving crouched toward the darkness. Ciesielski followed immediately. Pilecki was the last, closing the door behind him with the infinite care of someone who knows that any noise could mean death. The three men remained motionless for a few seconds that seemed like eternities, holding their breath, listening, evaluating. No alarm voices could be heard. No flashlights were pointing in their direction. The dogs were not barking. So far, the plan was working. They moved quickly toward the outer barbed wire. They had studied the intervals between patrols and knew they had a very narrow window of time. Using tools they had obtained from the camp workshops, they cut through the wire with quick, precise movements.
We have to make this
The barbed
last
wire tore
until
at
the
their
fall.
hands and clothes, but they did not stop. They could not afford to stop. Every second counted. Before moving away, one of them cut the telephone cables connecting the camp to the exterior guard posts. It was a crucial step in the plan. Without telephone communications, the guards who discovered their absence would have to alert the exterior posts by other means, giving them additional minutes of advantage. In an escape where the difference between life and death could be measured in minutes, that advantage was invaluable. Once on the other side of the barbed wire, the three men broke into a run. They ran with everything they had left of their strength, which after nearly 3 years of starvation and slave labor was not much. They ran across open fields, seeking the protection of hedgerows and trees. They ran with lungs burning and legs trembling, driven by a mixture of terror and euphoria that none of them had ever experienced. They were out. For the first time in nearly 3 years, There was no barbed wire around them, no watchtowers above their heads, no guards with rifles pointing at them. They were out. But the danger was far from over. They knew that when dawn came and their absence was discovered, the Nazis would launch a relentless manhunt. Tracking dogs would follow their trail. Soldiers would comb the countryside. Reconnaissance aircraft would fly over the area. And any civilian who found them could report them, whether out of fear of Nazi reprisals or for the reward the SS offered for the capture of fugitives. The three men moved southeast, seeking to get as far from the camp as possible before dawn. They alternated between walking and running, taking advantage of the darkness and the terrain's cover. They crossed streams to throw off the tracking dogs. They hid in ditches when they heard vehicles on nearby roads. They crawled through cultivated fields when the terrain's exposure did not allow them to walk upright. When dawn broke, the three men were exhausted but alive, and they had covered a considerable distance. They concealed themselves in a dense forest and spent the day hiding, sleeping in shifts while one stood watch. They could hear in the distance the sound of military vehicles patrolling the roads and occasionally the barking of search dogs. Their hearts stopped every time the sound seemed to draw closer, but the dogs never reached them. The precautions they had taken to cover their trail had worked. Over the following days, the three fugitives moved eastward, traveling exclusively at night and hiding during the day. The food they had brought ran out quickly, and they had to rely on what they could find in the countryside: roots, berries, water from streams. On a couple of occasions, they risked approaching isolated farms, where Polish families, risking their own lives, provided them with food, water, and temporary shelter. These encounters were extremely dangerous for both parties. If the Germans discovered that a family had helped escape prisoners, every member of that family, including children, would be executed. Nevertheless, the solidarity of the Polish people toward the prisoners of Auschwitz was deep and real, and many families were willing to take that risk. After several days of travel, the three men finally managed to establish contact with the local Polish resistance. They were taken to a safe house, where for the first time in days, they could eat a hot meal, wash and rest in a real bed. It was a moment of indescribable relief, but also of complex and contradictory emotion. They were safe, at least temporarily. But behind them in Auschwitz, thousands of their companions continued to suffer, continued to die. Freedom had a bittersweet taste. From the safe house, Pilecki was gradually transferred toward Warsaw, through the resistance network. The journey was long and tortuous, with multiple stops at safe houses and changes of identity. Each stretch of the route presented its own dangers: German roadblocks, military patrols, collaborationist informants. But Pilecki, who had survived nearly 3 years in Auschwitz, navigated these dangers with a calm and competence that impressed the resistance agents who accompanied him. When Pilecki finally arrived in Warsaw, he was received by the Polish resistance leaders with a mixture of admiration and concern. Admiration for what he had accomplished, for the intelligence he had gathered, for the courage he had demonstrated. Concern for his physical condition, which was deplorable. Pilecki had lost an enormous amount of weight. His skin had a grayish tone, his eyes were sunken, and his body bore the scars of nearly 3 years of constant abuse. The resistance doctors who examined him were amazed that he could even walk, let alone that he had been capable of escaping from one of the most heavily guarded places in Europe. But Pilecki had no time to recover. Immediately after his arrival in Warsaw, he set to work writing a complete and detailed report about everything he had observed in Auschwitz. This document, which came to be known as the Witold Report, or the Pilecki Report, is one of the most extraordinary testimonies of the Second World War. In it, Pilecki described with meticulous precision the conditions of the camp, the organizational structure of the SS, the methods of torture and execution, the process of industrial extermination of the Jews, and the resistance network he had built. The report was extensive, detailed, and, for anyone who read it, absolutely devastating. Pilecki did not resort to hyperbole or sentimentality. He wrote with the precision of an intelligence officer and the honesty of a witness who knew his words had to be credible to be effective. Every datum, every figure, every description was backed by direct observations or verified testimonies from other prisoners. It was a document designed to be irrefutable. The report was transmitted through resistance channels to the Polish government in exile in London. From there, it was shared with British intelligence services and eventually with the Americans. The intelligence agents who read it were profoundly shaken. One of them, as the story goes, had to stop reading halfway through the document because he could not continue. The content was simply too horrible to absorb in one sitting. Yet despite its emotional impact, the report did not provoke the response Pilecki had hoped for. Allied leaders recognized the importance of the information, but took no immediate measures to act against Auschwitz. The reasons were the same that had prevented action in the past: military priorities, logistical difficulties, and a certain reluctance to accept that what the report described could be literally true. There were also political considerations. The Western Allies did not want to antagonize the Soviet Union, which was advancing from the east and would eventually be the force that liberated Auschwitz. And a unilateral Allied attack on a target in the Soviet sphere of influence could complicate the already delicate relations between the Allies. For Pilecki, this inaction was more than frustrating. It was morally intolerable. He had seen with his own eyes what was happening in Auschwitz. He knew that every day that passed without action meant thousands more deaths. And yet the powerful of the world seemed unable or unwilling to act. It was one of the most bitter experiences of his life, and a wound that would never fully heal. After writing his report, Pilecki resumed his activity in the Polish resistance. He was assigned intelligence tasks and participated in various clandestine operations in Warsaw and its surroundings. But his mind never stopped being in Auschwitz with the companions he had left behind, with the thousands of people who continued to be murdered every day. In August of 1944, Pilecki participated in the Warsaw Uprising, one of the most heroic and tragic episodes of the entire Second World War. On the 1st of August, the forces of the Armia Krajowa rose against the German occupation of the Polish capital. The idea was to liberate Warsaw before the arrival of the Soviet Red Army, thus securing Polish independence against the new threat that Stalin represented. Pilecki fought in the streets of Warsaw for 63 days of fierce combat, leading his men with the same valor he had demonstrated in every previous trial of his life. The Warsaw Uprising was a catastrophe. The Polish insurgents, armed with light weapons and improvised explosives, faced German armored divisions, heavy artillery, and air attacks. The Soviets, who had advanced to the eastern banks of the Vistula, deliberately halted and provided no assistance to the Polish insurgents. Stalin wanted the Polish resistance destroyed so that it could not oppose the future Soviet domination of Poland. It was one of the most cynical betrayals of the war. After 63 days of fighting that destroyed much of the city and caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Polish civilians, the uprising was crushed. Pilecki was captured by the Germans and sent to a prisoner of war camp, where he remained until the end of the war in Europe in May of 1945. Liberation came with a bitter taste. Poland, which had been the first nation to resist Hitler, which had maintained the largest resistance organization in all of occupied Europe, which had suffered proportionally more than any other belligerent country, did not receive the freedom its citizens had hoped for during 6 years of brutal occupation. Instead, one tyranny was replaced by another. The Soviet armies that liberated Poland from the Nazi yoke brought with them a new system of oppression, Stalinist communism. The new Polish communist regime, imposed by Moscow and sustained by the Red Army, viewed the members of the Armia Krajowa not as heroes, but as enemies. The Polish resistance had fought for a free and independent Poland, an objective that was anathema to Stalin's plans to turn Poland into a Soviet satellite state. Veterans of the Armia Krajowa were persecuted, arrested, imprisoned, and in many cases executed by the new regime. Years of sacrifice, of suffering, and of extraordinary heroism were rewarded not with gratitude, but with persecution. Pilecki, true to his nature, refused to flee the country, as many of his resistance comrades did. He had opportunities to escape to the West, to seek asylum in Great Britain or the United States, where he would have been received as the hero he was. But Pilecki felt his duty was in Poland. His country needed him, now more than ever. And so, when the Polish intelligence services in exile asked him to remain in Poland to gather information about Soviet repression and the activities of the new communist regime, Pilecki accepted without hesitation. During the years immediately following the war, Pilecki operated once again in the underground, this time against a different enemy. He gathered information about the mass detentions, executions, tortures, and deportations that the communist regime was carrying out against resistance veterans and against any Pole who opposed the new order. He sent reports to the Polish government in exile in London, documenting the crimes of the communist regime with the same meticulous precision with which he had documented the Nazi crimes in Auschwitz. But the Polish communist regime, backed by Soviet intelligence services, was a formidable adversary. The Urząd Bezpieczeństwa, the Polish communist secret police, modeled after the Soviet NKVD, was ruthlessly efficient in hunting down dissidents. They used the same techniques of surveillance, infiltration, and terror that the Nazis had employed before them. And little by little, they closed the net around Pilecki. On the 8th of May, 1947, Witold Pilecki was arrested by the communist secret police. The irony was so cruel as to be almost unbearable. The man who had voluntarily entered Auschwitz to fight against Nazi tyranny, the man who had survived nearly 3 years in hell, the man who had escaped from one of the most heavily guarded death camps in the world, was captured by another secret police, by another totalitarian regime, in the same country for whose freedom he had sacrificed so much. What followed was an ordeal that, in many respects, was as cruel as what Pilecki had suffered in Auschwitz. He was subjected to months of brutal interrogation. The secret police agents used every method of torture at their disposal to extract information and, above all, to force him to sign a confession. They wanted him to admit to being a spy in the service of foreign powers, a traitor to the new communist Poland. Pilecki endured the torture with the same unbreakable fortitude he had demonstrated in Auschwitz. According to the testimonies of those who saw him during this period, his physical and moral resistance was extraordinary. But the human body has limits, even that of a man as exceptional as Pilecki, and the communist interrogators were experts in finding those limits and exceeding them. The trial against Pilecki began on the 3rd of March, 1948. It was a judicial spectacle designed not to determine the truth, but to serve the regime's propagandistic purposes. Pilecki was accused of espionage, treason, and preparation of an assassination attempt against senior communist government officials. The charges were fabricated, the evidence manipulated, the outcome predetermined. But it was a trial of the kind that the Soviet system had perfected into a macabre art, a theatrical performance of justice that had absolutely nothing to do with actual justice. Pilecki defended himself with dignity and courage. He rejected the charges, presented his record of service to Poland, described what he had done in Auschwitz and during the Warsaw Uprising. But his words fell on deaf ears. The tribunal was composed of judges who followed the party's instructions, and the verdict had been written before the trial began. On the 15th of March, 1948, Witold Pilecki was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to death. According to the testimonies that have survived, Pilecki received the sentence with a serenity that disconcerted his executioners. And it is said that he told one of his jailers that Auschwitz had been easy compared to this. Not because the physical suffering was less, but because in Auschwitz at least he knew he was being persecuted by the enemy. Now he was being persecuted by his own people, by the very country to which he had dedicated his entire life. In the months between the sentence and the execution, Pilecki had time to reflect on the complete arc of his life. He had been born into a world that no longer existed, had fought in wars that had redrawn the map of Europe, had voluntarily entered the darkest place in human history, had survived the unsurvivable, and now he was going to die. Not at the hands of the enemy against whom he had fought his entire life, but at the hands of those who should have been his allies. On the 25th of May, 1948, Witold Pilecki was executed with a shot to the back of the head at Mokotów prison in Warsaw. He was 47 years old. His body was thrown into a mass grave whose exact location remains unknown to this day. The communists did not merely kill Pilecki.
We have to make this
They
last
tried to
until the
erase his memory. His name was removed from the history books, his deeds forbidden, his very existence turned into a state secret. For more than 4 decades, under the communist regime, mentioning the name of Witold Pilecki in Poland could bring severe consequences. But truth has a way of persisting, even when the most powerful try to crush it. Pilecki's reports survived, hidden in secret archives, preserved by family members and friends who refused to forget. His story was transmitted in whispers, by word of mouth, through the clandestine circuits of Polish memory. And when the communist regime finally fell in 1989, the story of Witold Pilecki emerged from the shadows like a ghost demanding to be recognized. In 1990, Pilecki was officially rehabilitated and acquitted of all charges. His name was restored to the history books. His reports were published and studied by historians around the world. He was posthumously awarded Poland's highest military decorations. Streets, schools, and monuments bear his name throughout Poland today. The man the communists tried to erase from history has become one of the country's most revered national heroes. But the recognition came too late for Witold Pilecki. Too late for the man who voluntarily walked into hell. Too late for the spy who built a resistance network in the most dangerous place on earth. Too late for the soldier who fought against 2 tyrannies and was destroyed by the second. Too late for the father who left his children behind to fulfill what he believed was his duty. Too late for the human being who demonstrated with his life and with his death that courage can exist even when hope has vanished. The story of Witold Pilecki compels us to confront uncomfortable questions. It compels us to ask what we would have done in his place. It compels us to ask whether we would have the courage to voluntarily enter Auschwitz, to endure nearly 3 years of indescribable horror, to risk our lives every day, to transmit the truth to the outside world. The honest answer for the vast majority of us is no. We would not have done it. And that honesty is not cause for shame, but for awe at the greatness of what Pilecki did. His story also compels us to confront the moral failure of those who received his reports and did not act. The Allied leaders who read his descriptions of the mass extermination at Auschwitz and decided there were more urgent priorities. The bureaucrats who filed his reports in drawers that would not be opened again until after the war. The politicians who calculated that the cost of acting was too high, without considering that the cost of not acting was immeasurably greater. The Allied failure to respond to the information provided by Pilecki and other witnesses of the Holocaust is one of the darkest stains on the collective conscience of the Western world. And Pilecki's story compels us, finally, to remember that the fight for freedom and human dignity does not always end with the triumph of good over evil. Sometimes heroes are destroyed by the very systems they tried to save. Sometimes truth is suppressed for decades. Sometimes the most extraordinary sacrifice is rewarded with the most bitter betrayal. But that does not make the sacrifice any less valid, nor the heroism any less real. What Witold Pilecki did retains its greatness intact, regardless of how his story ended. Today, when we visit Auschwitz, when we walk the same paths Pilecki walked, when we see the barbed wire, the barracks, the watchtowers, we feel a shadow of what he must have felt. Only a shadow, because the full reality is beyond our capacity to comprehend. But even that shadow is enough to shake us, to remind us of what humanity is capable of in its darkest moments, and also of what extraordinary individuals like Pilecki are capable of in response to that darkness. In the halls of the Auschwitz Museum, among the mountains of shoes, suitcases, and human hair that the Nazis stored as plunder from their victims, there is a silence that speaks louder than any word. It is a silence that confronts us, that demands we remember, that forbids us to forget. And in that silence, if we listen carefully, we can hear the echo of Witold Pilecki's voice, the man who chose to enter hell so that the world could know what was happening there. His last wish, expressed shortly before his execution, was simple and devastating. He asked that his children know the truth. He asked that the truth about Auschwitz never be forgotten. And he asked that his sacrifice, and that of all who had died in the camp, serve as a permanent warning against barbarism, against indifference, against the moral cowardice that allows evil to triumph when good men decide not to act. More than 8 decades have passed since Witold Pilecki crossed the gates of Auschwitz. The world has changed in ways he could not have imagined, but the lessons of his life remain as relevant today as they were then. The lesson that a single individual, armed only with courage and conscience, can defy the most powerful and most evil systems. The lesson that truth, however uncomfortable, deserves to be told at any cost. The lesson that human dignity is an absolute, non-negotiable value that must be defended even when the cost of defending it is one's own life. Witold Pilecki never sought glory. He never sought recognition. He never sought to become a legend. He simply did what he believed was right, in the most impossible circumstances a human being can face. And in doing so, he left us a legacy that transcends borders, eras, and ideologies.
We have to
A
make
legacy
this
of
last
courage,
until the
of
top.
truth, and of an irreducible humanity that neither Auschwitz nor the firing squad could destroy. There are stories that time tries to bury. Witold Pilecki's was one of them for far too
I
long.
got you, Witold.
But the stories of
All right,
truly
gather
great
round
men
quickly.
have a
Discipline
way
is
of
paramount in these
resurfacing,
conditions. Our
of breaking
objective
through
lies
the
just beyond
layers of
this ridge.
silence and
Our
oblivion
objective lies
that
3
accumulate
clicks
over
past the
them.
ridge line. We
And
need to
now,
reach the position by
finally,
nightfall.
the world is
Make sure
beginning to
your gear
know
is
this
packed
extraordinary
tight. We don't
man,
want to lose anything in the
to
moment.
understand the magnitude of what he did, and to give him the place he deserves in the pantheon of humanity's heroes. Because if the Second World War taught us anything, it is that civilization is more fragile than we believe, that barbarism can emerge in the most unexpected places, and that when it does, it is men like Witold Pilecki, men who choose the light when everything around them is darkness, who remind us what it truly means to be human. His story is not merely a chronicle of horror and heroism. It is a mirror that forces us to look at ourselves and to ask, in the face of the most absolute darkness, the most extreme evil, the most intolerable injustice, what kind of person would we choose to be? Witold Pilecki chose, and his choice will reverberate for all eternity.